So I've just informed I did a really good intro that no one heard, and, and Dr. Culp has totally notified me. I appreciate that. So just a quick recap on that. Today we're sharing with Dr. Brian Culp, who was selected because he's worked in this space before and has some unique insights, I think, on this topic. That's an ever-moving target, so it's hard to latch on to. But he's a full professor at Kennesaw State University. He's published topics on youth physical activity and climate, anti-racism, spatial justice, and leadership in higher education. He's also helped create and facilitate research opportunities and civic engagement, as well as funded movement-based community inter-engagement programs. He's won numerous awards. I'm not going to be able to list them all, but he's also recognized as a Fulbright Scholar, as a fellow with the National Association of Kinesiology in Higher Education. He's done collaborations along this space with Shape America, Physical Education, Health Education Canada, Center for Disease Control, the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards, National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And his most recent projects have been in the viability of public pedagogy for racial justice-based concepts, and were presented in the book recently, Critical Race Studies in Physical Education, which was co-authored with Dr. Tara Blackshear. So anything I'm missing there, Dr. Culp?
No, you're not. And it's actually pretty funny that this started this way. Anytime we get into this type of topic, some people are trying to mute us. So I'm glad that we got this straightened out and figured out okay. And I think that's it. I mean, hopefully this is going to be informative for a lot of people because, as Dan has mentioned, we are really dealing with a fluid space right now. And I want to thank AKA for having the opportunity to have me here. So let's go ahead and get started.
Absolutely. And if you guys have any questions, by all means, shoot your questions through. Thank you for everyone who jumped on board to let me know you couldn't hear me. But as you have questions throughout, we may get to them during or we may to the end, but definitely shoot them through. And I will go ahead and turn this presentation over to you.
So excellent. So again, the presentation for the day is what is going on with state legislators and legislatures, excuse me, and DEI in higher education. Very appropriate topic, very interesting, and kind of looking at what we can sort of do here in terms of things. So let me go ahead and see where we're moving at. Can you go ahead and go to the next slide? I don't know if there we go. Here's our disclaimer. So one of the things that we sort of talk about at the outset, at first when Dan had asked me to do this, I wasn't sure if I was going to engage in this opportunity in terms of a topic because quite frankly, I didn't know how I was going to attack it because there's just so many different things going on in this space. As we know it, for those of us who are not as familiar with DEI and sort of the history of it, we're not going to give a full history of it today. I'll just kind of give a brief overview. Essentially, DEI, as we know it in higher education, started around the 1960s with the civil rights movement that happened in the United States. As we're speaking about EDI today, and we're speaking about justice, which is a part of that as well. And, you know, that's another conversation for another day because I don't know if justice can actually be fulfilled through some of the things that we're doing. But moving here, so when we think about EDI, we think about the diversity piece of that. Diversity, we think about increasing it, which is expressed in myriad forms, including race and ethnicity, including gender identity, including sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, language, culture, national origin, religious commitments, age, disability status, and also political perspective. When we think about equity, when we're looking at it, we're looking at about actively challenging and responding to bias, harassment, and discrimination. This includes policies of equal opportunity for all persons that don't discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, age, marital status, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, disability, religion, height, weight, or veteran status. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then last, inclusion. Which is pursuing deliberate efforts to ensure that institutions are places where differences are welcomed, different perspectives are welcomed, and also where every individual feels a sense of belonging. And those are different definitions that we have from the University of Michigan, for instance. So something to kind of keep in mind as we kind of move on here. Let me see in terms of our slides. I'm getting a note here in terms of moving on, in terms of progressing. All right, thank you. So today's discussion is going to cover a few different topics. The first one is going to be current climate and legislations. The second, we're going to talk about a few selected stories that have been really imprinted in the mainstream in the past few months. The third, I'm going to cover some institutional actions of notes. The fourth, I'm going to cover some concerns that have been brought up by experts and related to DEI and some gray areas potentially that legislators and legal experts have discussed. Also, some different areas that professors at different institutions have discussed in some of my conversations over the past few weeks, and also by looking at some things on social media and looking at some things on television. And then finally, we're going to spend a moment thinking about what can be done. And we may have some opportunities to field a few questions. As a reminder, throughout the presentation, please send Dan some questions. And if we can't answer it in this particular session, we can figure out a way to point you in the right direction with some things as well. Next slide, please. So one thing to kind of keep in mind when we talk about foundations, again, when we followed the civil rights movements of the 1960s, educators and social justice leaders looked to diversify K-12 and higher education. What we started dealing with pretty much after that, and we've seen more of this has been happening over the past 40 years or so. What people would consider conservative and heritage-minded think tanks have denounced DEI as radical issues, and they've denounced them as they're contrary to the principles of civilization and enlightenment, and also ideals of what constitutes knowledge. Next slide, please. So our current climate, there's a lot to be said here in terms of how we need to think about DEI. And when we think about our current climate, please proceed. We are thinking about bills. One of the biggest things with bills is when we're looking at it is in Florida and Texas in 2023 particular have brought about a wave of proposed policies. We see, as we'll get into our stories in a few minutes, a wide range of leadership firings, new appointments, and political maneuverings that are based around these bills. And essentially, they're created to stifle a lot of DEI initiatives and sort of throw a wrench into what people are planning in terms of making inclusive spaces on campus. We are thinking about things in terms of faculty speech, in and out of the classroom. Some of these topics, as we mentioned before, deal with race specifically and gender. Sexuality has been probably the third most thing that we have seen in these bills that these different legislators have been targeting. Equitable hiring practices have been targeted in eliminating programs that reportedly give unfair advantages to underrepresented groups. When we look at some other states such as Oklahoma and South Carolina and some of what's happening there in terms of bills, there's been demands that public colleges and universities account for all funds spent on DEI programs. University of North Carolina Board of Governors has just voted to eliminate a question from student applications that asked them to describe how they would contribute to a diverse and inclusive environment. What makes all these things tricky is looking at it in terms of these different requests are so broad and they're really open to a lot of interpretation, as we'll get into in a few minutes. And as some would suggest, what does DEI and what do these different bills mean in terms of banning? So does this mean just classes? Does this mean offices of support or retention? Does it mean recruitment-based programs? Does it mean programs targeted specifically for underrepresented minorities? Does it mean programs targeted for women in STEM, for instance? And what do we do about holidays? Because we all recognize the fact that many of these holidays are shared by people. So are we going to get to the point, because we recognize that many of our programs on campus are tied to holidays? So what this is and what this is turning into is just really a rapidly spreading mess, for lack of a better word. Proceed, please. So when we think about the different types of Supreme Court actions that have happened in the past 2 weeks, some of these decisions that have been cooking up for the past few years have generated new momentums for anti-DEI legislation. In May, in Ohio, the Senate, what we have sort of seen some anti-DEI legislation that we'll cover in a couple slides, but many of these states are red states. And as you can see here, this is a chart from the Chronicle of Higher Education as of 2 days ago. We started off talking about 38 at the beginning, 38 different states, and now that's gone up to 40 that's had some type of legislation either introduced or passed, or something that has been sort of taken off the books, and they're sort of figuring out how to try to re-implement those particular bills. And we're also seeing legislators, such as what's happening in Wisconsin, one of the House speakers there tweeted out plans to eliminate race-specific scholarships in the state of Wisconsin. As we'll come back to, this is a very important point piece to keep in mind in terms of DEI, because the bulk of these particular types of bills are focused on race and ethnicity thus far, and they're slowly spreading. Next slide, please. This is another chart from bestcolleges.com. If I would highly advise for you to go to this website if you want to look at some things in more details in terms of what may be happening in your particular state. As you can see, you see states there, big red is on watch, bills that are introduced or approved, and then no bills whatsoever. So when we think about these different legislations, we're thinking about these things in terms of specifically, as the Chronicle would suggest, legislation that would prohibit colleges from banning diversity, equity, and inclusion officers on staff, banning mandatory diversity training, prohibiting institutions from using diversity statements in hiring and promotion, or prohibiting colleges from using race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in admissions or employment. So that is the big overall discussion of those particular types of bans. Now, when we get to specific states, next slide, please. Many of us have heard about this desire to ban what is seen as divisive concepts. For example, consider the state of Tennessee, the state of Iowa. Here's some examples of legislation that has been drafted that is generally the same. Now, if you do a search for this, you're going to find about 40 different points. And obviously, I didn't want to go through all of these because you can probably find them. But again, some examples: one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. So that's a divisive concept. Another one is the third point here: an individual, by virtue of the individual's race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same sex. An individual feeling some type of discomfort, guilt, anguish, or form of psychological distress because of the individual's race or sex. One big one that's been going around a lot the past few months is the state of the United States is fundamentally or irredeemably racist or sexist. And again, moving on, that is seen as a diversive concept. A few other ones: promoting or advocating the violent overthrow of the United States government. Obviously, that is an interesting one given the events of the past couple of years. Promoting division between or resentment of a race, sex, religion, creed, nonviolent political affiliation, social class, or group of people. And then I think the other big one that you'll see is ascribing character traits, values, moral, ethical codes, or beliefs to a race of sex or to an individual because of the individual's race or sex. Now, again, these are examples of divisive concepts that are being put into current legislations in 40 states. So now when we think about practice and theories and move to the next piece here, some people think, oh, well, Brian, what are some examples of how that could look for me in the fall? Well, here's one example. Think about a professor who covers political controversies in class, or someone who could be seen as students as pushing an agenda. And we'll go over some examples of how that may look at the end of this particular presentation. But, there are some things that do come up as we are teaching classes that are brought up, and somebody may deem that is you as a professor is pushing an agenda. The second one is one that I deal with a lot, and it's certainly something we're paying attention to here because we do have a public health program here in our department. But providing impact for faculty to stay away from discussing anything that could provide some sort of insight on inequity. So, for instance, we're talking about physical activity in pools and health inequity and ableism. And for some of y'all who may follow me on Twitter, one of the things I tweeted out this morning was a discussion of what's happening in Baltimore City right now. It's been a discussion of people closing pools and what that means for certain communities. And when you think about like the history of people not having access to pools and the health inequities and just basically desegregation and basically things such as structural inequality, those are things that in a health class or in a public health setting or in a physical activity setting, I would feel like I need to discuss. But someone could look at this and say that that is a potential problem or divisive concept. Think about this one: high potential for certain classes to not be approved or evaluated with greater scrutiny. And we're thinking about classes that may focus on multicultural, cultural, social justice concepts. Those things may be looked at in a completely different way. And we also recognize as well for our untenured faculty and contingent faculty, they are at greater risk with some of these bills because it's very difficult to, it's not that it's impossible to let someone go with tenure, but if you don't have tenure, you're speaking out about some of these things. It's not necessarily the most positive environment in most situations. Next, please. Some other things that we've seen is the idea of recent gag orders. I have a link there for you at the end. So when we look at how this is broken down since 2020, and many people, when you do the research on this, thinks that these sorts of bans in foundations started in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. You started seeing a couple different things. So first of all, backlash against Black Lives Matters protests in different parts of the country. The 1619 project has been something that was stated as something that has been part of this creation of gag orders. Creating the Saving American History Act that many politicians in Washington have tried to push through. Executive Order 13950 that was done by former President Donald Trump and was disbanded by our current president, President Biden. And Executive Order 13950 basically wanted to outlaw any discussions related to race, class, and any places. Devices concepts, as we mentioned before, being reframed as stopping CRT. The word wokeness, which is you could probably see everywhere that's being used in a negative fashion. As we see in the state of Florida, for instance, in the states of Tennessee, the changing of hands of selected trustees, so trustees being removed or placed to have a certain political ideology. And then a proposed state blacklight list for faculty and staff in violation. That has been sort of mentioned as well. As we see here, this example, Tennessee education bill, as we discussed, would ban discussion of systemic racism at colleges. Okay, and one of the different legislators there, representatives, as mentioned, that it sounds like fascism and authoritarianism. Again, we won't have time to get into that today. Next slide, please. So our impacts, when we look at this as well, and we're looking at how the foundation of these different things starts, is the potential impacts for this are significant. So first of all, thinking about the end of college and university recognition and funding, for instance, for Black student unions and other similar groups. Okay. Restrictive or prohibitive content when you think about public lectures. For some of us who are in that space, at what point are we told that we can only lecture on certain things at universities? In some situations, one of the things that have been talked about is accreditation. So for some programs, not being able to, as part of the standards, is having a discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if those things are not in programs, then accrediting bodies look at that and they will potentially strip accreditation away. Colleges picking up more slack for educational gaps. Okay, when we think about it in terms of what's not currently being taught in high schools. So if we see what we're starting to see right now, which are these concepts being banned in K through 12 education, then that puts a lot of pressure on colleges to teach these different concepts. And to what extent will those concepts be taught? Okay. When you think about risk management, when in terms of institutional responsibility for academic freedom, I'll get into that in a minute in more detail. Bills targeting outside private funding. So for instance, if you're a company who wanted to support scholarships or wanted to support initiatives for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or support a researcher or support an endowed funding, those bills could target that potentially as well. And as we will see, some research grants require a diversity statement. Provides a problem for universities that cannot provide this due to legislation that may stop it. For example, we see a couple current things here. Most recently, University of Houston's College of Medicine received a $5 million gift from Blue Cross Blue Shield in 2020. 1.5 million of that was used to set for a pipeline program to create a more diverse student body. Some of that particular funding was used to hire an assistant dean of diversity and outreach. So when we think about these grants, it's very rare to get a grant for 1 year. These grants usually last anywhere from 3 to 5 years in most cases. And then we think about grants, we reapplying for them and renewing those different types of things. So you think about 2020, we're in 2023 right now, situation where people are thinking about stopping funding here. And this is happening even in smaller community college. $2.2 million grant here from the Department of Education at Western Iowa Tech Community College. The second phase of that particular grant is intended to help create a more equitable campus culture. I mean, they wrote that into the grant, and now we're seeing these different bills and legislative actions targeting this particular type of funding, which are not just there to help students, but they overall help the community as well. Next. So as promised, I'm going to go over a few selected stories. This is one you probably are the most feel familiar with. This is the story of Dr. Kathleen McElroy, who is unfortunately back at UT Austin now. What she was offered was a job at Texas A&M, and it was celebrated in a public fashion. One particular piece as well, she was essentially had worked at the New York Times for 2 decades and formerly directed the University of Texas Austin School of Journalism. One of the things that she was brought in to do, what she wanted to do with Texas A&M, was to revise the university's journalism program. This was a pretty significant national search, but the deal fell apart in basically a span of a month because a couple of vocal constituents in the Texas A&M system and boosters and donors expressed concerns over her experience at the Times, and specifically her work with race and diversity in newsrooms. When the announcement happened, the other offers continued to get watered down over a period of time. So as you sort of see, it went from a full tenure protected position to an altered 5-year deal of professor of practice. And then it got whittled down to offered a 1-year particular contract. At this point, Dr. McElroy elected to go back to UT Austin and rescinded her resignation. Interestingly enough, as well, if you were paying attention to the follow-up story to this on Monday, is the interim dean there of the Texas A&M College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Bermudez, announced that he would be stepping down that afternoon, citing the controversy and the need to preserve the work of the colleges of arts and sciences, and basically mentioning the fact that he couldn't protect any of his professors in this particular situation. So this is one story where you see forcible intimidation, you see a removal of an offer. But I think one thing to also think about is that this constitutes the loss of opportunity for 2 people. And if you're thinking about it in terms of some of us who served in interim roles, you can't assume that you're going to be offered the permanent position or an opportunity to interview for it. But you can assume the fact that there's a significant monetary piece that goes along with interim roles and things that factor into retirement. And when you don't have the opportunity to do those because you're essentially intimidated out of a position, this constitutes more of a equity and diversity issue, and quite frankly, I think a legal issue for the university. Next slide, please. Another selected story is about DEI criticism, and I think we're probably going to see a few more of these pop up over the next few months. This is John Halligan. He is a former assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and at the University of Toronto. He was applying for a tenure track position at the University of California, Santa Cruz. That was posted last July. So this was last year. It continues to remain open. one of the reasons that he is protesting, or he has taken up a lawyer, because he feels that, and part of the job application was asking him for a diversity statement. He feels that a diversity statement is not necessarily something that should be desirable. He claims that his views on colorblind inclusivity, viewpoint diversity, and merit-based evaluation means that he can't truthfully compete for a position which involves receiving a high score on rubrics used to evaluate candidates. And I think this is interesting because this involves some international aspects to it as well, which is why I sort of put it here. A lot of times when someone's moving from one country to another, but they may not necessarily be versed on the rules of application specific to certain states. But I do think this is an example of one type of thing that may be challenged by some professors in the future who don't want to do DEI statements. Next, please. This is an example, because I didn't want to just use examples from other people's states without using mine. This has been most recently Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones here on the left side asking for clarification regarding DEI spending at University Systems of Georgia universities. Essentially, about $66 million got moved out of the university budget for the whole state. And Sonny Perdue, who interestingly enough is in charge of the USG, or University System of Georgia now, rather surprisingly to a few of us, was saying that these DEI actually has a place. And next slide, please. DEI, because it constitutes what is considered a wide variety of populations under the DEI umbrella. So it's not just race and ethnicity, which many people think that DEI refers to. His view, it is first generation college students, it's adult learners, it's STEM students, it's international students. There are people who from obviously work in different areas of rural and urban residents, and it's a bigger array than what people think. And again, this was interesting because this is a former governor who's having this particular discussion about what DEI means. And if you follow this story a little bit more, the Chancellor Perdue actually wrote a 200-page response, which I think was very interesting to kind of look at it in big context if those of y'all want to go into more detail with that particular story. Next, please. So one of the things to also think about as well, as I was looking at that particular story over the last week, and I was just thinking about some potential things, is this question of who are the real targets of anti-DEI legislation. As we see here, and I don't know if many of you know this, and this is not just one particular story. I mean, white women, for instance, when we think about affirmative action, white women have benefited the most from affirmative action since its inception. I mean, that's not me saying that. There's a lot of statistics that not only suggest that, but basically prove that. But one of the different things that I think about as well when we think about these targets of anti-DEI legislation recently is that recent criticisms of justice, failed to discuss Western philosophical perspectives that have been highlighted on college campuses for decades. So we don't have any discussion of John Rawls. There's no discussion of Thomas Polk. There's no discussion of Martha Nussbaum. But interestingly enough, over the past few years, the critiques have been against Nicole Hannah-Jones. They've been against Kimberly Crenshaw. They've been against Derek Bell. The critiques have been really focused on race and ethnicity, and more so focused on Black people, and more so focused on Black women. Very interesting thing, I think, to sort of keep in mind as we sort of move on the next few months here and sort of watch these particular things. Because as I often critique other people who do work in this area with social justice, is that I think a lot of people think about social justice in terms of civil rights to now. And social justice in terms of thinking about theories of justice have been around for a long period of time, but yet right now they're not being critiqued at the same vicious level that critical race theory, for instance, is in some of the work by Black and Latino scholars. Next slide, please. So moving to institutional actions, are going to be some discussions of some different things that are sort of popped up here. As I mentioned, I was going to talk about Ohio briefly. So here we go with the next slide here. Boards of trustees of the Ohio State University in May released a collective statement opposing Senate Bill 83, which, among other things, would prevent new school partnerships in China. That's something that's really personal to me as a person who does a lot of international work. So, again, keep that in mind. Limit DEI training, prevent university employees and staff from striking, and listing new tenure evaluation requirements and requiring certain American history courses for students. So, yeah, so the Board of Trustees basically said, yeah, this is not cool. This is not going to stand, and this aggression is just not necessary. Also, we see organizations such as NAACP have come out and have in Legal Defense Fund. They've endorsed the Freedom to Learn campaign, which is a movement created to fight against erasure of history and the experiences of marginalized communities, and also the discussion of promotion of critical race theory and equitable legislation in K through 12 and higher education. So these are some examples of people who've been pushing back. Next slide, please. One of the other ones I wanted to highlight was PEN America. And if you're not familiar with it, PEN America is a fairly open group, but one of the things that they do is they work with Campus Connect. They have recently started talking about this Champions of Higher Education campaign, which brings about 100 college and university leaders to fight against censored legislations. So you've got former college presidents a part of this, you've got system leaders, you have student leaders on campus to help reconfirm faith in higher education. The campaign statement as well, one of the things that they're doing is working to try to help people better discuss this and help legislators who are in favor of EDI better draft different ways to attack this problem of wanting DEI taken out. Next slide. All right. So as we come to a close here for this particular section, we're going to cover a few other concerns that have been expressed through various articles, features, reports, and social media. The first of which that I found interesting, and this is from Nature, faculty in the United States are still not diverse. And you can see sort of the charts here, and I decided to leave this particular notice here for you. You can actually look at it. It's pretty relatively new, last year. But U.S. universities have made public commitments to recruit and retain faculty of color. And this is from the abstract. Analysis of these 3 federal data sets shows that at current rates, diversity in the United States will never reach parity. Yet colleges and universities could achieve parity in 2050 by diversifying their faculty at 3.5 times the current pace. So we think about what could happen versus what is currently being put in bills to try to decrease the number of diverse faculty that's on campus. And again, this came out at the beginning of 2022. And I think many of us who are in this space are savvy enough to recognize is that it seems like that's one of the other reasons why people are really going nuclear, for lack of a better word, on trying to stop diversity, equity, and inclusion on campuses, because there's been a lot of focus on it. And parity takes away, equity takes away power for a lot of people in those particular situations. But that's an interesting article if you want to go refer to it. The second piece to kind of think about as we move toward the future is what will be the status of legal issues and representation. And again, these are people who have talked about the numbers. The Louisiana Board of Regents said efforts there to curb DEI will lead to a lack of equitable access to its 28 institutions and classes that will reflect fewer viewpoints and experiences. Those actions in turn would undercut its goal to help at least 60% of the state and the working age adults get a college degree by 2030. Some of the lawyers who've been involved with this is from Nicholas Simpson. One of the things that he's mentioned is that slashing campus diversity programs could open up the door to many discrimination claims by minority students and faculty. Reason why we said is because DEI practitioners are often the ones who spot pitfalls and they address these things before these issues become bigger. Right. The other piece that we have here is, as I mentioned earlier, accreditation bodies, as there's some type of DEI commitment and practice involved with it. we want to have diverse hiring and recruitment of public colleges and universities. If there's not a diverse hiring and recruitment along with diverse students, along with these different things that are in place in terms of standards, these states could potentially lose accreditation. And we also see this other piece with job losses, which we are paying attention to in certain states. Diversity leaders and associated staff at public institutions are in precarious situations because they don't have the protections that come with faculty tenure. So they're more likely to see their jobs eliminated, or they're repurposed, or they're moved around because of the types of actions that are taking place right now with legislators. If you continue to move the people around like they're seesawing, you get no consistency. And as we recognize, when we do these initiatives with diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not just mapping it out. It's having people there who can consistently help deliver on these particular types of programs. Next, please. Here's some other ramifications. And again, these are just things that we've been picking up here from different news sources, different social media conversations that are currently happening with colleagues in the field. My non-favorite thing is more trainings. I think we can all appreciate many of us already have too many trainings to do already. But that's another ramification of people changing diversity, equity, inclusion. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility to think about people and looking at syllabus language. I think folks have spent a lot more time in the past few years, at least at my university, looking at the language of the syllabus and saying what exactly needs to be in the syllabus. I think what you will see with as these policies, if they are interacted, is people really examining syllabi in more scrupulous ways. Examination of people's offices and books, and that's something that's been discussed. And some people may think, well, that's really extreme, but you think about it. I mean, if you have a book in your class that you're reading, or a book that you have as part of your personal library, and someone looks at it, they may try to examine some of the personal effects that you have in your offices, because we recognize that we do have students that come and meet in our offices from time to time. Okay. Another piece, how do you manage the ethics of using underrepresented groups for physical solvency while having no support for them on campus? I think this is a big discussion that's happening at a lot of universities right now, because, as we mentioned before, there are a lot of targeted initiatives for underrepresented populations. So the ethics of having them come to a university and having no support system for them on campus is pretty ridiculous, in my opinion. Some other things: increases in campus violence, increase in hate speech in terms of people thinking that hate speech equals freedom of speech, increased scrutiny of study abroad programming. I think one of the things that could happen is what you may see that is sort of related to communities is people trying to put up speak English only bills. And I think we also have to recognize that 2024 is an election year. So I think you're going to see a few of these things ramp up in ways that we have not even thought about. Some other ramifications: as faculty, staff, and student reporting offending faculty or people that they perceive as offending faculty in bad faith. Again, people may not think that that's an issue, but we've already seen it from the K through 12 perspective with some of the bills that have been passed there from the K through 12 scene. Um, Parents, even though they may not have an understanding of what's being taught in class, calling hotlines or reporting faculty. Increased surveillance, so video in terms of sharing materials with the public, and informal faculty loyalty test. Okay, CVs and bios are more open to the public. Decreased value for qualitative research. And some of you may be asking yourself, well, why, Brian? I mean, we know that qualitative research, and full disclosure, I do a lot of qualitative research, but one of the different things that people talk about with qualitative research is that it gives voice to underrepresented populations. You tend to have more of a conversation with individuals in order to get a better perspective to use with some of the quantitative numbers that we particularly use. Well, changing how underrepresented faculty are featured in their work. We recognize the fact that one big piece with universities from time to time, whether we think this is good or bad, is that they like to highlight the work of underrepresented faculty, whether we think that is performative or whether we think that is part of what the mission of schools will be doing. but you have people who have biases, and they may say to themselves, you know what, hey, we need to be careful about who we're highlighting with different types of work. Organizations potentially changing who they highlight for awards and fellowship. And I think sadly, and we've already seen this regardless of these bills, is more of this focus on this open talk of conflict management and resolution, which can be somewhat coded as how to deal with certain populations instead of actual real DEI work. So wrapping it up, what could we potentially do? And I did not have a whole lot to put here because I think we will have some opportunities to really think about this, because there's a lot that presented here in this short 35 minutes. I think some general guidelines that some people have mentioned here is, first of all, being prepared. And as we mentioned, laying groundwork for defeating legislation before it is actually introduced. I think the second piece is read state and school departmental governance policies and national policies. And this is just as an aside, this is a discussion that I have with my colleagues many times, is that people don't read. They don't read policies. They don't read things related to the university and their job. They don't read a lot of things related to other than their contract that they sign every year if they do that. But I think we need to be a little bit more intentional about governance policies, because a lot of these things get written at the top level at a university and then they filter down and people feel like they don't have a voice, but they don't have a voice because they don't pay attention to policies that happen on campus. Embracing coalition building. So getting away from our silos, talking to staff, students, and private schools as well to see what they're doing. Interrogating administrative efforts. So and we kind of put here, some people have mentioned, don't expect them to always assist. And that's not really a slap against administrators, so to speak, but administrators have a certain role, and sometimes they have to be a little bit more of a face of a school. I think with faculty, one of the things that we want to use is data. As I put some different examples of some pieces here, the data is available. We don't often use it in a way that is really helpful to make our points a lot of times. And again, that goes back to governance. And then getting other organizations involved. And we've seen some examples here and informative of the consequences of non-action. So for instance, paying attention to what happens to K through 12 and looking at what happens here, and then looking at some of our community partners and letting them know, if programs get removed or if grant funding gets taken away, then we don't have opportunities to really help people as we would like. So, and again, perhaps many of you have had questions or comments. So here's some things maybe to think about here. What's currently the tones at your university? What do you think has been done so far, if anything? And given the fact that I've really spent a lot of time here talking, is there anything else we need to be aware of? So thank you for your time. And I'm just going to sit back and let Dan sort of drive the next few minutes here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Culp. And we do have a couple questions. And for those who are listening, if you have any questions you want to ask, definitely shoot them into the chat so I can get them up and we can go ahead and get them in front of him. And let me pull those up for you real quick. So the first question I have in front of me is coming from Jason Wagner. I put it at the bottom there as well, but I'll read it out loud so it's easier to hear. Based upon these recent past 2 to 3 years anti-DEI legislative initiative bills, where do you see the environment of higher education kind of going in the next 2 to 3 years?
It's a great question, Jason. I think the question is, I think it depends, and that's not the best answer ever. I think if you are a new faculty member coming into this space, there is a lot to be distracted with. And I think I think new faculty members have to sort of figure out, first of all, reading policy and really being understanding of what that actually means. How does that impact your promotion and tenure? Okay. Talking to people who may be faculty affairs, because it's important for them to understand how this potentially impacts your work. I think if you're tenured, I'm not going to sit here and say you're safe, But I think tenured faculty members have a responsibility to help newer people in this space sort of navigate these things. I think sometimes tenured faculty members do a horrible job of that. And that's also assisting with contingent faculty as well, because I think what we need to recognize is that if any one of those pieces go away for a long period of time, then the next thing they're going to be focused on is the tenured faculty members who they think are safe. And then as I sort of remind my administrative colleagues, well, if they start cutting funding for DEI and they start realizing that some of this money that they're cutting for DEI is actually not as much money as they think they're cutting, well, who do you think they're going to be cutting next in terms of some of these things, right? So I would like to be optimistic. I would like to think that this is just a blip in time, and perhaps it is. But I think, if anything, it's an opportunity for us to get a little bit more intentional about paying attention to things that we have not necessarily done before.
No, excellent answer. Very much accurate how we tend to not pay attention to things around us or put our heads in the sand as things keep happening in our stratosphere, but don't feel like they affect us. Jason also had a follow-up question. I'm going to add to this one. Actually, I thought it was a great question. So, how do you foresee these anti-DEI initiatives or bills affecting the number of applications for college and the anticipated enrollment cliff of 2025, 2026?
That's a great question. I do not know the answer of, but I mean that's a lot. If I knew the answer to that one, man, I'd be a university president somewhere. Here's the thing. Depending on what conversation you have, you will have people who, so let me just break this here. So Black students, African American students, there's been some lot of discussion of, okay, well, these different things are happening, and why am I wasting my time at a PWI or prominently white institution? Why can't I just go to historically Black institution, for instance, and just time there? But I think we have to recognize the fact that all of the universities are being targeted. It's not just, I mean, because if they're going to target a PWI, they're going to target a HBCU by trying to take away funding from universities. So I think the applicants to college thing is it's a big question. As I kind of alluded to in our presentation, universities are at the point where they're completely fine with having applicants because it's part of the business. We got to make the things running, but it's like the question is what's going to happen to things such as diversity statements, which you can't write anymore, really. Legacies, which some universities are thinking about getting rid of. So I think it's a fluid situation. I don't know. We in my state, we've talked about the enrollment cliff, but we're one of the fastest growing universities in the United States. So we're still trying to figure this out too. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
And by all means, if anyone figures out the enrollment cliff solution, let me know. We'll go in consulting together. That is the retirement plan that I support.
Question. And there's so many different things, Dan, just briefly. I mean, we've talked about this. I mean, the student of when we went to school, right, is not the same student. They're learning in a completely different way. And then we also have to take into account what happened. We keep talking about what happened during the pandemic, but students have changed. So maybe they're starting off at a community college. Maybe many of them have just said they're going to be influenced and they're not going to go to college at all. Or maybe they're going to take a few years off and start college when they're a little bit older. I mean, we haven't even figured that out yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's an excellent point, and one that, as a person who has absolutely college-aged kids, watching this shift take place, not just with them, but their friends, as they're navigating very different mindset than when I went to school, which was not that long ago, but definitely completely different mindset. I think it's a fascinating thing that we'll just see continue to change. Now, with that, I did have a question, all right, coming from Greg Rousseau, which was, which anti-DEI bill do you feel has had the most negative effects so far with universities?
That's a great question, Greg. Thank you. I would probably submit, my God, there's just so many different ones. And without targeting one in particular, I would probably tell you generally the ones related to race and ethnicity who have specifically focused on this idea of CRT and divisive concepts and talking about overthrowing the government. I think that has had the most negative effects. And I'll tell you why. because the political climate that we're in right now, when you start telling people and putting into people's mind that there's going to be some type of overthrow of government, because we think about government just in terms of the United States federal government, but governments are actually university governments too, right? They're smaller forms of government. So I think much of that language, when you combine it with campus carry bills, and when you combine it with the fact that you're going to get people who want to have speakers on campus who are going to have talk about divisive concepts, whether they really intellectually want to talk about it or they just want to stir the pot because we have an election coming up and we recognize we're in a polarized nation. I think anything related to race and ethnicity right now, in terms of those, getting rid of those, have had the most negative effects because it's based on fear. It's not based on facts. If I can get you scared enough of the other person who's walking next to me in a classroom and they don't say anything and I don't need to know about them, then there's no reason to have any real intellectual conversation that can help with health disparities, for instance.
Absolutely. I have another question from Rebecca Ogletree. Our state has received a great deal of woke attention, and colleges and universities are already having difficulty filling positions because people don't want to transfer to such an environment. I can understand that conversation.
Yeah.
That's more of a comment, but do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, other than yeah.
Yeah.
But again, it's that interrogation of what do we mean when we say woke,
Yeah.
right? And to be quite frank with you, I mean, some people are afraid. Some people are worried about their safety, and maybe not necessarily their safety, but when you bring in families into the equation, yeah, because we have to think about that. You want to go to a place where you get tenure. You want to go to a place where you can stay there for a long period of time because, as we said before, in many cases, your retirement may be tied to that. So you don't want to be a job jumper because in higher education, when you look at it as a job jumper, that's a negative too, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I do think that's an interesting point. I've seen in the last 5 years more conversations of the politics of a state play a role in hiring across multiple people going to different states. And it's interesting because people do start taking account their values. Does that state match their values? And it's been an interesting thing that, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, you didn't hear as much as part of the conversation. And now it's kind of like, well, do I follow along or believe what the state believes? And so, um, thank you, Penny. Penny's giving a shout out for the information. Again, Dr. Culp, thank you for doing amazing. I had a question emailed in, so it's coming in
Yeah.
as anonymous. So this is a solution question. And then that'll probably be our last question for the time. And that question was, so what are people supposed to do if their states have already moved into removing those terms? So if you're doing something like having to create a new, how do I say this? A new job hire setup or a new mission statement or something along those lines. And historically, we want people to feel welcome. So we use diversity inclusion as our terms to make sure that people know that's how we are. What's the recommendation now that we're trying to produce all this documentation, but we've had to repeal some of those words out depending what state you're in?
Yeah. My first recommendation is to see what the heck's going on with faculty affairs or the equivalent at your particular university, because in some of these cases these things have already been determined, they've already been done. So there's not really, I mean, you have to work unfortunately in the confines of whatever your university is kind of working with there. And I think we also have to keep in mind, even with these policies, these are developing situations, and what sometimes has to happen is that things have to get so bad at a university, because universities are completely reactionary, that it impacts they impact I don't know, they're going to pull me out of here if I continue to say too much. They're going to pull, students are going to say, this is a bad climate, faculty is going to be a bad climate, you start losing things, and as you start losing it, then people start figuring out, what, people don't want to be here, so something needs to change. So we're going to need to figure out how to get around these policies or how to change them, because if universities are looked at as a business, which I don't think they should be, but we're seeing more and more they are, they're going to start saying to themselves, you know what, hey, we're not getting it done here, and stuff starts happening. So again, I wish there was a one size fit all solution to this. I mean, we're working through this here. I mean, I haven't even seen how our documentation is going to change. And this is coming from the past spring, where we just recently changed from a 3-point scale for promotion and tenure to a 5-point scale. So we're not even got that comfortably in, and now we got a new set of rules that may be coming in terms of who do we hire, how do we hire them, what kind of questions, what are the rubrics. So I would just say pay attention to some schools that are progressively doing this. California would be an example, and hopefully you're not in California. I mean, they're not the only example, but they are an example of trying to think about creative ways to sort of get around all these kind of sketchy rules right now.
All right, thank you. I appreciate answering questions, Dr. Culp. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for tackling this extremely complicated topic that we're still just figuring out as we go along. And it is a moving target. Ever since we wrote the copyright for this to go out for ad a couple weeks ago, we've had more bills introduced. Yeah. And so, who knows what will be in 6 more months from now. But with that, everyone, thank you for attending conversations like these that we're trying to figure out what to do, how to navigate, and the best options and where things might be. This is what we do at our AKA workshops and so forth. So definitely come join us in January. Start planning now with 6 months out. And then, of course, keep track of our webinars. We have a couple in the works right now. We're discussing and lining up our speakers for this fall. Like I said, if there's anything you're interested in hearing too, by all means, we definitely go ahead and we'll pull you guys in. And you guys can definitely make suggestions. Just email me at daniel.burt@tmuk.edu, and we'll go ahead and put those up and get them in the can ready for you guys to go in this fall. It just takes us lining up the speakers who can answer those questions. So again, Dr. Culp, thank you so much for everything you've done, and AK for hosting this. So until next time, thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, man. Everybody be safe.